lots of different configurations of PA systems available, all offering different options to suit various applications and venue sizes. For example, if you're a solo performer playing small bars or cafes, or maybe you need a portable system for conferences or sporting events, you'll probably want to look at something like an all-in-one line array PA system. Or on the flip side, if you're installing a PA at a larger venue or festival, you're more than likely going to need a much more complicated Firstly then, let's look at some of the gear that we're going to be showing off in the examples today. We've got a pair of Yamaha DXR12 Mark II speakers for the front of house sound. That's what your audience will be hearing. A pair of slightly smaller DXR10s, which for the purposes of this video we'll be using as fold-back monitors. And this is so the singer or musicians in your band can hear what's going on stage. And this isn't essential, but if you're a DJ or a band needing a little more bass end, we're also going to add a subwoofer, in this case a Yamaha DSX15. These are all active PA speakers, meaning that they all have internal amplifiers, which makes setting up the system much simpler, and there's less gear to carry around compared to a system that uses separate speakers and amps. The mixer we're going to be looking at is the Yamaha MG16XU, which is a medium-sized 16-channel mixer, but everything that we're going to be talking about here will easily be transferable to a larger or smaller mixing desk, depending on the amount of inputs that you need. Finally, for live sound, you're mainly going to be using dynamic microphones, as these are tougher and less prone to feedback than fragile studio condenser mics. So something like the industry standard Shure SM58 or this Lewitt Audio DM440, which can be used for both vocals or for miking up guitar amps, toms and snare drums. Looking at a band setup first, ideally you want to position your mixing desk at the back of the room with a separate sound engineer who can hear what the audience is hearing, adjusting levels on the go. But this does mean that A, you need someone completely separate from the band to operate the mixer, and B, you'll need a way to run all of your cables to the back of the room, and this is usually via a long multi-core or snake cable, but these can be quite bulky and heavy and add an additional cost to your setup. In smaller venues though, the most common thing to do is position your mixer at the side of the stage, meaning you can elect a member of the band to be in charge of adjusting levels, and all of your mics can then connect to the mixer using standard length cables. Singing guitarists, drummers or keyboard players will probably want to use a boom stand to allow for more positioning options, whilst singers who don't play an instrument and brass players are probably better off with a simple straight stand, which takes up less room and looks a little neater on stage. And if you're miking up a drum kit or a guitar amp, short boom stands or mic clamps are probably your best option, as they allow you to get microphones into much tighter spaces. If you were to position your speakers at the back of the stage behind the microphones, you're much more likely to encounter problems with feedback, which is where the sound from the speakers is picked up by the microphones, causing an infinite feedback loop, resulting in that horrible ear-piercing whistling sound. You'll also probably want to mount your speakers on speaker stands, raised to around about or maybe slightly higher than head height, as if you place them on the floor at a lower level, the sound waves will get blocked as it hits your audience, resulting in a quieter, more muffled sound for anyone who's at the back of the venue. Just remember though, when you are using speaker stands, always install the safety pins to avoid any accidents caused by the stands collapsing under the weight of the speakers. Now if you are integrating a subwoofer into your PA system, this can actually be placed pretty much anywhere around your stage area, as the very low bass frequencies that they produce are much less likely to cause feedback from microphones, and in terms of the stereo image, it's really difficult to hear where the bass end is coming from when you're actually in a venue. For the sake of convenience and aesthetics though, the most common thing is to have a pair of subwoofers sitting on the floor directly below your main speakers, which also means that instead of using tripod speaker stands, you can just use speaker poles which mount directly into the subwoofers to lift your main speakers up into the air. Monitor speakers, or wedge monitors, are usually placed on the floor and angled upwards facing the opposite direction to your main speakers. And most active PA speakers nowadays are designed to be multi-purpose, so they can either be mounted on stands for use as front of house speakers or laid on their sides as wedge monitors. As without monitor speakers, especially at higher volumes in larger rooms, it can be really difficult to hear if you're singing in tune or keeping time. So that's the basics of positioning the components of a PA system for a band setup. But if you're a DJ, then any mics that you might be using, but you're probably going to be using less inputs and there's no real need for foldback monitors. So you just need to position your speakers either side of your DJ console or lectern. Meaning each will require mains power. So make sure you've got enough long kettle lead type IEC cables and a few extension cables, power splitters, as these can overheat if too many speakers or amps are plugged in at the same time. Now, most mixers and active speakers will give you the choice of using either a 1/4 inch jack connector, so that's a standard guitar cable, or balanced XLR connectors, which is the same cables that we'll be using for the microphones. Wherever possible, we definitely recommend using the XLR cables, as these offer a stronger signal with less noise over longer distances, a sturdier, more reliable connection, and these types of cables can easily be joined together if you need to extend them. To connect the main front of house speakers, you need to find the master or main outputs on your mixer. There should be two, one for the left speaker and one for the right, and these will be what's known as a male XLR connector, which usually indicates an output. On a standard XLR cable, the connector on one end will be a male and the other end will be a female. To identify these, and without sounding too crude, the male connector is the one with the 3 little poles and the female is the one with the 3 little holes. So you're going to need 2 long XLR cables with the female connectors plugging into the male output sockets on the mixer, running the left output to your speaker on the left hand side of the stage and the right output to the right hand speaker. The cables then connect into the female XLR connector inputs on the speakers, making sure that everything clicks and locks into place for a firm connection. And if your speakers give you the option like these Yamahas do, make sure that the input is set to a line level, not a mic level, which is designed instead for connecting a mic directly to the speaker without the use of a mixer. Now, you may find if you're using a DJ mixer or controller, such as this Traktor Kontrol S2, that you don't actually have XLR outputs available. Instead, you'll find RCA phono style connectors. The principle is still the same though. There'll be a master stereo output, you'll just need to use a phono to jack cable instead to connect to your speakers. But again, just remember to set the input to line level. If you are using a subwoofer or subwoofers, things will be slightly more complicated. First, you'll need to connect your main mixer output to the input on the sub, and then take another shorter XLR cable to link the output from the sub into the input of your main speaker. And there will be a couple of ways of doing this depending on whether you're using 1 or 2 subs. As most subwoofers offer a built-in crossover feature, this means that they'll split the sonic frequency spectrum, so the lower bass frequencies will be pushed out through the subwoofer and the mid-range and higher frequencies will be sent to your main speakers, resulting in a much more defined sound with less risk of distortion caused by the bass end blasting through the smaller speakers. And some subs, such as the Yamaha DXS range, will offer options for different crossover points. As you can see, this one's got options for 120Hz, 100Hz or 80Hz, meaning only the frequencies above these thresholds will be sent to the main speakers, leaving the subwoofers to handle the thumping bass frequencies. 16XU that we're showing for the examples today, there's 4 auxiliary outputs which can be used as monitor sends. The number will be daisy chained together using XLR cables. It just means that all of the monitors will be sent the same mix. Separate monitor or auxiliary outputs, however, allow you to send a different mix to individual monitors. So for example, your lead singer will probably want lots of their own vocals in the monitor at the front, but less of everything else, whilst a drummer at the back will probably want to be able to hear more of the guitar and the bass. In terms of connections, however, active wedge monitors connect much in the same way as your front of house speakers, using either XLR cables or, in the case of this Yamaha MG16 mixer, 1/4 inch jack instrument cables, which connect from the auxiliary outputs into the line inputs on the speakers. Very simple, as most of the inputs will use either a twin stereo RCA or a USB connector for turntables and laptops, but on a mixing deck the speakers, and 1/4 inch jack cables for line inputs such as keyboards or acoustic guitars. XLR mic cables are available in different lengths up to around about 50 feet, but instrument cables are usually limited to lengths of around about 20 feet. So if you do need to extend one of these, but ensure a strong noise-free connection for, let's say, an acoustic guitar, you may want to use something known as a DI box, which converts your signal from an unbalanced jack to a balanced XLR cable. Connecting the cables to a mixer is pretty straightforward. Mics connect to the balanced inputs and line inputs go into the 1/4 inch jack or RCA phono sockets. Just make sure to label up your channels as you go to help you remember what's plugged into each channel. And if you're confused by the inputs such as the ones on this Yamaha MG mixer, these are known as combi inputs, so they'll actually accept either an XLR or a 1/4 inch jack connector. On a mixing desk. Now, mixers come in all shapes and sizes, but don't let all of those little knobs and faders intimidate you. They all work in a very similar way and are actually pretty simple to understand if you break them down into individual input channels. So here we are looking at the mixer, which, as I mentioned, is a Yamaha MG16XU, which means that it's got inputs for 16 channels, which are broken down into these columns of knobs. So we've got 8 mono inputs, that's for your microphones, and then 4 stereo inputs, which can be used for things like keyboards, MP3 players, laptops, or maybe if you've got something like a Line 6 Helix guitar processor, you can connect into a stereo input. So it may look like an awful lot of knobs, but you've only really got to understand what they do on one channel, because the rest of them are just duplicate controls for the other inputs. The mic that you can hear me talking through at the moment is connected to channel 1, so let's take a look at the controls for that channel. Each input channel on a mixer is going to have an input gain knob and a channel volume control, which will either be a knob or a fader like the one we're looking at here. The input gain adjusts the sensitivity of an input, so for example a dynamic mic like the one I'm using at the moment will probably require a little more gain than a hotter line level signal, whilst the channel volume control is what's used to actually balance the volume of the inputs in the final mix that will be sent to the speakers. The important thing is not to overload the inputs, which can cause unwanted distortion and increase the likelihood of feedback. So as you hear, if I turn up the gain a little bit, the mic is going to get louder, but we're going to start getting kind of distortion. And if I talk a little bit louder, we'll start seeing some peak lights. Luckily, most mixers will have a peak light. So if I talk very loud, we can see it starts flashing. We've got a little bit of distortion there. The level meters up here, flashing red, which is what we don't want. So I need to back off the gain of that microphone. We're going to go round to about 2:30, 3 o'clock on the dial. So what we're looking for is a nice strong signal without any distortion or peaking. But as I said earlier, the amount of gain will depend on the type of microphone or instrument that you're connecting to the input. Once you've set the input gain, you shouldn't need to touch that control again, as you can then just use the channel's volume fader to balance the level in the mix. Looking at the other controls, each channel on a mixer will usually feature some sort of EQ, with the main parameters being high, mid and low, or treble, mid-range and bass. And these allow you to shape the tone of an input, working in the same way as an EQ on a hi-fi or guitar amp, and they really can help a mic or instrument to cut through a mix. So here's our treble control. You can hear it's getting a little more muffled as I turn it down, and brighter and treblier as I turn it up. The mid-range allows you to scoop the mids to give you that kind of more radio broadcast voice, or you can boost the mid-range if you need that kind of honkier sound that's going to cut through a mix. And obviously the low controls are for our bass frequencies, so if it turned down we should have a thinner sound, and as I turn it up, bass, 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 bass. Things should get a lot boomier. And a quick tip, when you are setting up your mixer for the first time, always make sure that all of those EQ controls are set flat or bang in the middle, so you know where your starting off point is when you're tweaking the tone of your channels. Each channel also features a pan control, which allows you to set where you want the individual inputs to sit in the stereo mix. So for example, if you're listening on headphones, you should be able to hear me panning my voice over to the left-hand side of the mix. So now I should be talking in your left ear or on your left speaker. And now I'm going to pan over to the right-hand side. So this is panned hard right in the right speaker. And then we can just pan back to the center. Now, in a live environment, however, you are probably going to want most of your mono microphones to be panned centrally, meaning they're not going to be louder in one speaker than they will be in the other, unless, of course, this is something you specifically want to do. Moving on, most mixers nowadays also feature built-in effects, such as reverbs and delays. You choose the type of effect that you want up in the master effects section. So for example, I've got this one set to patch number 1, which is a hall reverb, which usually works really well on vocals. And then on each channel, you'll find an effects send knob, which adjusts how much of that reverb is applied to that particular input. So here's me talking without any of that effect applied, a totally dry signal. But as I start to turn up the effects send knob, you should start to hear the reverb come in. Reverb. Reverb. Lots of reverb. And you can choose how much or how little of that effect that you want on each input channel. So for example, you might want quite a bit of reverb on a vocal, but none on the keyboard or guitar player's channels, as they might be using their own effects. The last couple of knobs that we're going to look at on our channel strip are the monitor or auxiliary sends that we talked about a moment ago. And these allow you to adjust how much of that channel is sent to an individual monitor mix. So for example, let's say we're using two monitors. One's connected to auxiliary output 1 and positioned at the front of the stage for our lead singer, and the second is connected to auxiliary output 2, positioned at the back of the stage by the drummer. The auxiliary send knobs 1 and 2 on each of the channels will then allow you to balance how much of that particular input is sent to each monitor speaker. So if I wanted to send a lot of this microphone to the monitor that's plugged into auxiliary channel 1, I need to turn up the auxiliary send knob 1 on the microphone channel. But let's say that I've got an acoustic guitar plugged into channel 2 and our drummer with the monitor plugged into auxiliary 2 wants lots of acoustic guitar but none of the singer. I've got to make sure that the auxiliary 2 send on the microphone channel is turned right down, but then the auxiliary 2 send on the acoustic guitar channel is turned up. So our lead singer will now have lots of their vocals coming through the monitor that's plugged into auxiliary 1, but the drummer with the monitor at the back of the stage plugged into auxiliary 2 isn't going to have any of the lead singer's vocals, but he's going to have lots of acoustic guitar. And this is the basic principle of creating individual monitor mixes that can be sent out to separate monitors. So aside from those input channel knobs, most mixers will also feature output controls. We've got overall level knobs for our effects return and the auxiliary monitor sends. And most importantly, there's a master stereo output, which controls the overall volume that's being sent to your front of house speakers. So that's everything connected up and a basic overview of the controls to get you started on a mixing desk. The last thing to do now is power everything up so you can start your sound check. Before you do this, however, always make sure that the master volume controls on both the mixer and the speakers are turned down so you don't get any loud pops, bangs or feedback when you turn everything on. It's usually worth starting with the volume controls on the speakers themselves turned down pretty low, so you can then set all the levels on the mixer first. And once you're happy that you're not overloading any of the inputs or outputs, usually indicated by flashing red lights on the level meters, you can then turn up the volumes on the speakers themselves to gig levels. And that's pretty much it.